Section 23 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 23. The Borgias. Chapter 13, Part 1. The time had now come for the Duke of Valentinois to continue the pursuit of his conquests. So, since on the 1st of May in the preceding year the Pope had pronounced sentence of forfeiture in full consistory against Julius Caesar of Verano, as punishment for the murder of his brother Rudolph for the harbouring of the Pope's enemies, and he had accordingly been mulcted of his fief of Camerino, which was to be handed over to the Apostolic Chamber, Caesar left Rome to put the sentence in execution. Consequently, when he arrived on the frontiers of Perugia, which belonged to his lieutenant, Gianpaolo Baglioni, he sent Oliverotto da Fermo and Orsini of Guarini to lay waste the march of Camerino, at the same time petitioning Guido d'Ubaldo di Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, to lend his soldiers and artillery to help him in this enterprise. The unlucky Duke of Urbino, who enjoyed the best possible relations with the Pope, and who had no reason for distrusting Caesar, did not dare refuse. But on the very same day that the Duke of Urbino's troops started for Camerino, Caesar's troops entered the duchy of Urbino, and took possession of Caldi, one of the 4 towns of the little state. The Duke of Urbino knew what awaited him if he tried to resist, and fled incontinently, disguised as a peasant. Thus, in less than 8 days, Caesar was master of his whole duchy, except the fortress of Maiolo and San Leone. The Duke of Valentinois forthwith returned to Camerino, where the inhabitants still held out, encouraged by the presence of Julius Caesar di Verano, their lord, and his 2 sons, Venantio and Hannibal. The eldest son, Gian Maria, had been sent by his father to Venice. The presence of Caesar was the occasion of parleying between the besiegers and besieged. A capitulation was arranged whereby Verano engaged to give up the town, on condition that he and his sons were allowed to retire safe and sound, taking with them their furniture, treasure, and carriages. But this was by no means Caesar's intention, so, profiting by the relaxation in vigilance that had naturally come about in the garrison when the news of the capitulation had been announced, he surprised the town in the night preceding the surrender, and seized Caesar di Verano and his 2 sons, who were strangled a short time after, the father at La Pergola and the sons at Pesaro, by Don Michel Corelio, who, though he had left the position of sbirro for that of a captain, every now and then returned to his first business. Meanwhile, Vitellozzo Vitelli, who had assumed the title of General of the Church, and had under him 800 men-at-arms and 3,000 infantry, was following the secret instructions that he had received from Caesar by word of mouth, and was carrying forward that system of invasion which was to encircle Florence in a network of iron, and in the end make her defence an impossibility. A worthy pupil of his master, in whose school he had learned to use in turn the cunning of a fox and the strength of a lion, he had established an understanding between himself and certain young gentlemen of Arezzo to get that town delivered into his hands. But the plot had been discovered by Guglielmo dei Pazzi, commissary of the Florentine Republic, and he had arrested 2 of the conspirators, whereupon the others, who were much more numerous than was supposed, had instantly dispersed about the town, summoning the citizens to arms. All the Republican faction, who saw in any sort of revolution the means of subjugating Florence, joined their party, set the captives at liberty, and seized Guglielmo. Then, proclaiming the establishment of the ancient constitution, they besieged the citadel, whither Cosimo dei Pazzi, Bishop of Arezzo, the son of Guglielmo, had fled for refuge. He, finding himself invested on every side, sent a messenger in hot haste to Florence to ask for help. Unfortunately for the cardinal, Vitellozzo's troops were nearer to the besiegers than were the soldiers of the most serene republic to the besieged, and instead of help, the whole army of the enemy came down upon him. This army was under the command of Vitellozzo, of Gianpaolo Baglioni, and of Fabio Orsino, and with them were the 2 Medici, ever ready to go wherever there was a league against Florence, and ever ready at the command of Borgia, on any conditions whatsoever, to re-enter the town whence they had been banished. The next day more help in the form of money and artillery arrived, sent by Pandolfo Petrucci, and on the 18th of June the citadel of Arezzo, which had received no news from Florence, was obliged to surrender. Vitellozzo left the men of Arezzo to look after their town themselves, leaving also Fabio Orsina to garrison the citadel with 1,000 men. Then, profiting by the terror that had been spread throughout all this part of Italy by the successive captures of the duchy of Urbino, of Camerino, and of Arezzo, he marched upon Monte San Severino, Castiglione, Aretino, Cortone, and the other towns of the valley of Chiana, which submitted one after the other almost without a struggle. When he was only 10 or 12 leagues from Florence, and dared not, on his own account, attempt anything against her, he made known the state of affairs to the Duke of Valentinois. He, fancying the hour had come at last, for striking the blow so long delayed, started off at once to deliver his answer in person to his faithful lieutenants. But the Florentines, though they had sent no help to Guglielmo de' Pazzi, had demanded aid from Chalmont d'Umbest, governor of the Milanese, on behalf of Louis XII., not only explaining the danger they themselves were in, but also Caesar's ambitious projects, namely, that after first overcoming the small principalities and then the states of the second order, he had now, it seemed, reached such a height of pride that he would attack the King of France himself. The news from Naples was disquieting. Serious differences had already occurred between the Count of Armagnac and Gonzalvo di Cordova, and Louis might any day need Florence, whom he had always found loyal and faithful. He therefore resolved to check Caesar's progress, and not only sent him orders to advance no further, step forwards, but also sent off, to give effect to his injunction, the Captain Imbo with 400 lances. The Duke of Valentinois, on the frontier of Tuscany, received a copy of the treaty signed between the Republic and the King of France, a treaty in which the king engaged to help his ally against any enemy whatsoever, and at the same moment the formal prohibition from Louis to advance any further. Caesar also learned that beside the 400 lances with the Captain Imbo, which were on the road to Florence, Louis XII. Had, as soon as he reached Asti, sent off to Parma Louis de la Tromouille and 200 men at arms, 3,000 Swiss, and a considerable train of artillery. In these two movements combined, he saw hostile intentions toward himself, and, turning right about face with his usual agility, he profited by the fact that he had given nothing but verbal instructions to all his lieutenants, and wrote a furious letter to Vitellozzo, reproaching him for compromising his master with a view to his own private interest, and ordering the instant surrender to the Florentines of the towns and fortresses he had taken, threatening to march down with his own troops and take them if he hesitated for a moment. As soon as this letter was written, Caesar departed for Milan, where Louis XII. Had just arrived, bringing with him proof positive that he had been calumniated in the evacuation of the conquered towns. He also was entrusted with the Pope's mission to renew for another 18 months the title of Legate a Latere in France to Cardinal d'Umbest, the friend rather than the minister of Louis XII. Thus, thanks to the public proof of his innocence and private use of his influence, Caesar soon made his peace with the King of France. But this was not all. It was in the nature of Caesar's genius to divert an impending calamity that threatened his destruction so as to come out of it better than before, and he suddenly saw the advantage he might take from the pretended disobedience of his lieutenants. Already he had been disturbed now and again by their growing power, and coveted their towns. Now he thought the hour had perhaps come for suppressing them also, and in the usurpation of their private possessions striking a blow at Florence, who always escaped him at the very moment when he thought to take her. It was indeed an annoying thing to have these fortresses and towns displaying another banner than his own in the midst of the beautiful Romagna which he desired for his own kingdom. For Vitellozzo possessed Città di Castello, Bentivoglio Bologna, Gianpaolo Baglioni was in command of Perugia, Oliverotto had just taken Fermo, and Pandolfo Petrucci was lord of Siena. It was high time that all these returned into his own hands. The lieutenants of the Duke of Valentinois, like Alexander's, were becoming too powerful, and Borgia must inherit from them, unless he were willing to let them become his own heirs. he obtained from Louis XII 300 lances wherewith to march against them. As soon as Vitellozzo Vitelli received Caesar's letter, he perceived that he was being sacrificed to the fear that the King of France inspired. But he was not one of those victims who suffer their throats to be cut in the expiation of a mistake. He was a buffalo of Romagna who opposed his horns to the knife of the butcher. Besides, he had the example of Verano and the Manfredi before him, and, death for death, he preferred to perish in arms. So Vitellozzo convoked at Magione all whose lives or lands were threatened by this new reversal of Caesar's policy. These were Paolo Orsino, Gianpaolo Baglioni, Hermes Bentivoglio, representing his father Gian, Antonio di Venafro, the envoy of Pandolfo Petrucci, Oliver Toxo da Fermo, and the Duke of Urbino. The first 6 had everything to lose, and the last had already lost everything. A treaty of alliance was signed between the confederates. They engaged to resist whether he attacked them severally or altogether. Caesar learned the existence of this league by its first effects. The Duke of Urbino, who was adored by his subjects, had come with a handful of soldiers to the fortress of San Leone, and it had yielded at once. In less than a week, towns and fortresses followed this example, and all the duchy was once more in the hands of the Duke of Urbino. At the same time, each member of the confederacy openly proclaimed his revolt against the common enemy, and took up a hostile attitude. Caesar was at Imola, awaiting the French troops, but with scarcely any men, so that Bentivoglio, who held part of the country, and the Duke of Urbino, who had just reconquered the rest of it, could probably have either taken him or forced him to fly and quit the Romagna, had they marched against him. All the more, since the 2 men on whom he counted, viz. Don Ugo di Cardona, who had entered his service after Capua was taken, and Micheletto, had mistaken his intention, and were all at once separated from him. He had really ordered them to fall back upon Rimini, and bring 200 light horse and 500 infantry, of which they had the command. But, unaware of the urgency of his situation, at the very moment when they were attempting to surprise La Pergola and Fossombrone, they were surrounded by Orsino of Gravina and Vitellozzo. Ugo di Cardona and Micheletto defended themselves like lions, but in spite of their utmost efforts, their little band was cut to pieces, and Ugo di Cardona taken prisoner, while Micheletto only escaped the same fate by lying down among the dead. When night came on, he escaped to Fano. But even alone as he was, almost without troops at Imola, the confederates dared attempt nothing against Caesar, whether because of the personal fear he inspired, or because in him they respected the ally of the King of France. They contented themselves with taking the towns and fortresses in the neighbourhood. Vitellozzo had retaken the fortresses of Fossombrone, Urbino, Cali, and Agobbio. Orsino of Gravina had reconquered Fano and the whole province, while Gian Maria di Verano, the same who by his absence had escaped being massacred with the rest of his family, had re-entered Camerino, borne in triumph by his people. Not even all this could destroy Caesar's confidence in his own good fortune, and while he was on the one hand urging on the arrival of the French troops, and calling in to his prey all those gentlemen known as broken lances, because they went about the country in parties of 5 or 6 only, and attached themselves to anyone who wanted them, he had opened up negotiations with his enemies, certain that from that very day when he should persuade them to a conference they were undone. Indeed, Caesar had the power of persuasion as a gift from heaven, and though they perfectly well knew his duplicity, they had no power of resisting. Not so much of his actual eloquence, as that air of frank good nature which Machiavelli so greatly admired, and which indeed more than once deceived even him, wily politician as he was. In order to get Paolo Orsino to treat with him at Imola, Caesar sent Cardinal Borgia to the confederates as a hostage, and on this Paolo Orsino hesitated no longer, and on the 25th of October, 1502, arrived at Imola. Caesar received him as an old friend from whom one might have been estranged a few days because of some slight passing differences. He frankly avowed that all the fault was no doubt on his side, since he had contrived to alienate men who were such loyal lords and also such brave captains. But with men of their nature, he added, an honest, honourable explanation such as he would give must put everything once more in statu quo. To prove that it was goodwill, not fear, that brought him back to them, He showed Orsino the letters from Cardinal Ambroise, which announced the speedy arrival of French troops. He showed him those he had collected about him, in the wish, he declared, that they might be thoroughly convinced that what he chiefly regretted in the whole matter was not so much the loss of the distinguished captains who were the very soul of his vast enterprise, as that he had led the world to believe, in a way so fatal to his own interest, that he could for a single instant fail to recognize their merit, adding that he consequently relied upon him, Paolo Orsino, whom he had always cared for most, to bring back the Confederates by a peace which would be as much for the profit of all as a war was hurtful to all, and that he was ready to sign a treaty in consonance with their wishes so long as it should not prejudice his own honour. Orsino was the man Caesar wanted. Full of pride and confidence in himself, he was convinced of the truth of the old proverb that says, "A pope cannot reign 8 days if he has half the Colonnas and the Orsini against him." He believed, therefore, if not in Caesar's good faith, at any rate in the necessity he must feel for making peace. Accordingly he signed with him the following conventions, which only needed ratification, on the 18th of October 1502, which we reproduce here as Machiavelli sent them to the magnificent Republic of Florence. Agreement between the Duke of Valentinois and the Confederates. Let it be known to the parties mentioned below, and to all who shall see these presents, that His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, of the one part, and the Orsini of the other part, together with their confederates, desiring to put an end to differences, enmities, misunderstandings, and suspicions which have arisen between them, have resolved as follows. There shall be between them peace and alliance true and perpetual, with a complete obliteration of wrongs and injuries which may have taken place up to this day, both parties engaging to preserve no resentment of the same, and in conformity with the aforesaid peace and union, His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall receive into perpetual confederation, league and alliance all the lords aforesaid, and each of them shall promise to defend the estates of all in general, and of each in particular, against any power that may annoy or attack them for any cause whatsoever, excepting always nevertheless the Pope Alexandre VI and His very Christian Majesty Louis XII, King of France. The lords above named promising on the other part to unite in the defence of the person and estates of His Excellency, and also those of the most illustrious lords, Don Gaffredo Borgia, Prince of Squillace, Don Roderigo Borgia, Duke of Sermeta and Bicelli, and Don Gian Borgia, Duke of Camerino and Neggi, all brothers or nephews of the Duke of Romagna. Moreover, since the rebellion and usurpation of Urbino have occurred during the above-mentioned misunderstandings, all the confederates aforesaid, and each of them shall bind themselves to unite all their forces for the recovery of the estates aforesaid, and of such other places as have revolted and been usurped. His Excellency the Duke of Romagna shall undertake to continue to the Orsini and Vitelli their ancient engagements, in the way of military service and on the same conditions. His Excellency promises further not to insist on the service in person of more than one of them, as they may choose. The service that the others may render shall be voluntary. He also promises that the second treaty shall be ratified by the Sovereign Pontiff, who shall not compel Cardinal Orsino to reside in Rome longer than shall seem convenient to this prelate. Furthermore, since there are certain differences between the Pope and the Lord Gian Bentivoglio, the confederates aforesaid agree that they shall be put to the arbitration of Cardinal Orsino, of His Excellency the Duke of Romagna, and of the Lord Pandolfo Petrucci, without appeal. Thus the confederates engage, each and all, so soon as they may be required by the Duke of Romagna, to put into his hands as a hostage one of the legitimate sons of each of them, in that place and at that time which he may be pleased to indicate. The same confederates promising, moreover, all and each, that if any project directed against any one of them come to their knowledge, to give warning thereof, and all to prevent such project reciprocally. It is agreed, over and above, between the Duke of Romagna and the confederates aforesaid, to regard as a common enemy any who shall fail to keep the present stipulations, and to unite in the destruction of any states not conforming thereto. Signed, Caesar Paolo Orsino, Agapit, Secretary. End of section number 23. Section 24 of Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. Celebrated Crimes, Volume 1 by Alexandre Dumas. Translated by G.B. Ives. Section 24. The Borgias, Chapter 13, Part 2. At the same time, while Orsino was carrying to the Confederates the treaty drawn up between him and the Duke, Bentivoglio, not willing to submit to the arbitration indicated, made an offer to Caesar of settling their differences by a private treaty, and sent his son to arrange the conditions. After some parleying they were settled as follows. Bentivoglio should separate his fortunes from Vitelli and Orsini. He should furnish the Duke of Valentinois with 100 men-at-arms and 100 mounted archers for 8 years. He should pay 12,000 ducats per annum to Caesar for the support of 100 lances. In return for this, his son Hannibal was to marry the sister of the Archbishop of Enna, who was Caesar's niece, and the Pope was to recognize his sovereignty in Bologna. The King of France, the Duke of Ferrara, and the Republic of Florence were to be the guarantors of this treaty. But the convention brought to the Confederates by Orsino was the cause of great difficulties on their part. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular, who knew Caesar the best, never ceased to tell the other condottieri that so prompt and easy a peace must needs be the cover to some trap. But since Caesar had meanwhile collected a considerable army at Imola, and the 400 lances lent him by Louis XII had arrived at last, Vitellozzo and Oliverotto decided to sign the treaty that Orsino brought, and to let the Duke of Urbino and the Lord of Camerino know of it. They, seeing plainly that it was henceforth impossible to make a defence unaided, had retired, the one to Città di Castello, and the other into the kingdom of Naples. But Caesar, saying nothing of his intentions, started on the 10th of December, and made his way to Casenna with a powerful army once more under his command. Fear began to spread on all sides, not only in Romagna, but in the whole of northern Italy. Florence, seeing him move away from her, only thought it a blind to conceal his intentions, while Venice, seeing him approach her frontiers, dispatched all her troops to the banks of the Po. Caesar perceived their fear, and lest harm should be done to himself by the mistrust it might inspire, he sent away all French troops in his service as soon as he reached Casenna, except 100 men with Monsieur de Candali, his brother-in-law. It was then seen that he only had 2,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry with him. Several days were spent in parleying, for at Casenna Caesar found the envoys of the Vitelli and Orsini, who themselves were with their army in the duchy of Urbino. But after the preliminary discussions as to the right course to follow in carrying on the plan of conquest, there arose such difficulties between the general-in-chief and these agents, that they could not but see the impossibility of getting anything settled by intermediaries, and the urgent necessity of a conference between Caesar and one of the chiefs. So Oliverotto ran the risk of joining the Duke in order to make proposals to him, either to march on Tuscany or to take Sinigalia, which was the only place in the Duchy of Urbino that had not yet fallen into Caesar's power. Caesar's reply was that he did not desire to war upon Tuscany, because the Tuscans were his friends, but that he approved of the lieutenant's plans with regard to Sinigalia, and therefore was marching towards Fano. But the daughter of Frederick, the former Duke of Urbino, who held the town of Sinigalia, and who was called the Lady Prefect because she had married Gian della Rovere, whom his uncle Sixtus IV had made prefect of Rome, judging that it would be impossible to defend herself against the forces the Duke of Valentinois was bringing, left the citadel in the hands of a captain, recommending him to get the best terms he could for the town, and took boat for Venice. Caesar learned this news at Rimini, through a messenger from Vitelli and the Orsini, who said that the governor of the citadel, though refusing to yield to them, was quite ready to make terms with him, and consequently they would engage to go to the town and finish the business there. Caesar's reply was that in consequence of this information he was sending some of his troops to Casenna and Imola, for they would be useless to him, as he should now have theirs, which together with the escort he retained would be sufficient, since his only object was the complete pacification of the Duchy of Urbino. He added that this pacification would not be possible if his old friends continued to distrust him, and to discuss through intermediaries alone plans in which their own fortunes were interested as well as his. The messenger returned with this answer, and the confederates, though feeling, it is true, the justice of Caesar's remarks, none the less hesitated to comply with his demand. Vitellozzo Vitelli in particular showed a want of confidence in him which nothing seemed able to subdue, but, pressed by Oliverotto, Gravina, and Orsino, he consented at last to await the Duke's coming, making concession rather because he could not bear to appear more timid than his companions, than because of any confidence he felt in the return of friendship that Borgia was displaying. The Duke learned the news of this decision, so much desired, when he arrived at Fano on the 20th of December, 1502. At once he summoned 8 of his most faithful friends, amongst whom were Denna, his nephew Michelotto, and Ugo di Cordona, and ordered them, as soon as they arrived at Sinigalia, and had seen Vitellozzo, Gravina, Oliverata, and Gorsino come out to meet them, on a pretext of doing them honour, to place themselves on the right and left hand of the 4 generals, 2 beside each, so that at a given signal they might either stab or arrest them. Next he assigned to each of them his particular man, bidding them not quit his side until he had re-entered Sinigalia and arrived at the quarters prepared for him. Then he sent orders to such of the soldiers as were in cantonments in the neighbourhood to assemble to the number of 8,000 on the banks of the Meteras, a little river of Umbria, which runs into the Adriatic and has been made famous by the defeat of Hannibal. The Duke arrived at the rendezvous given to his army on the 31st of December, and instantly sent out in front 200 horse, and immediately behind them his infantry, following close in the midst of his men-at-arms, following the coast of the Adriatic, with the mountains on his right, and the sea on his left, which in part of the way left only space for the army to march 10 abreast. After 4 hours' march, the Duke at a turn of the path perceived Sinigalia, nearly a mile distant from the sea, and a bowshot from the mountains. Between the army and the town ran a little river, whose banks he had to follow for some distance. At last he found a bridge opposite a suburb of the town, and here Caesar ordered his cavalry to stop. It was drawn up in 2 lines, one between the road and the river, the other on the side of the country, leaving the whole width of the road to the infantry, which latter defiled, crossed the bridge, and entering the town, drew themselves up in battle array in the great square. On their side, Vitellozzo, Gravina, Orsino, and Oliverotto, to make room for the Duke's army, had quartered their soldiers in little towns or villages in the neighbourhood of Sinigalia. Oliverotto alone had kept nearly 1,000 infantry and 150 horse, who were in barracks in the suburb through which the Duke entered. Caesar had made only a few steps towards the town when he perceived Vitellozzo at the gate, with the Duke of Gravina and Orsino, who all came out to meet him, the last 2 quite gay and confident, but the first so gloomy and dejected that you would have thought he foresaw the fate that was in store for him, and doubtless he had not been without same presentiments, for when he left his army to come to Sinigalia, he had bidden them farewell as though never to meet again, had commended the care of his family to the captains, and embraced his children with tears, a weakness which appeared strange to all who knew him as a brave condottiere. The Duke marched up to them, holding out his hand, as a sign that all was over and forgotten, and did it with an air at once so loyal and so smiling that Gravina and Orsino could no longer doubt the genuine return of his friendship. And it was only Vitellozzo still appeared sad. At the same moment, exactly as they had been commanded, the Duke's accomplices took their posts on the right and left of those they were to watch, who were all there except Oliverotto, whom the Duke could not see, and began to seek with uneasy looks. But as he crossed the suburb he perceived him exercising his troops on the square. Caesar at once dispatched Michelotto and Denna, with a message that it was a rash thing to have his troops out, when they might easily start some quarrel with the Duke's men, and bring about an affray. It would be much better to settle them in barracks, and then come to join his companions, who were with Caesar. Oliverotto, drawn by the same fate as his friends, made no objection, ordered his soldiers indoors, and put his horse to the gallop to join the Duke, escorted on either side by Enna and Michelotto. Caesar, on seeing him, called him, took him by the hand, and continued his march to the palace that had been prepared for him, his 4 victims following after. Arrived on the threshold, Caesar dismounted, and, signing to the leader of the men-at-arms to await his orders, he went in first, followed by Oliverotto, Gravina, Vitellozzo Vitelli, and Orsino, each accompanied by his 2 satellites. But scarcely had they gone upstairs and into the first room when the door was shut behind them, and Caesar turned round, saying, "The hour has come." This was the signal agreed upon. Instantly the former confederates were seized, thrown down, and forced to surrender with a dagger at their throat. Then, while they were being carried to a dungeon, Caesar opened the window, went out on the balcony, and cried out to the leader of his men-at-arms, "Go forward!" The man was in the secret. He rushed on with his band towards the barracks where Oliverotto's soldiers had just been consigned, and they, suddenly surprised and off their guard, were at once made prisoners. Then the Duke's troops began to pillage the town, and he summoned Machiavelli. Caesar and the Florentine envoy were nearly 2 hours shut up together, and since Machiavelli himself recounts the history of this interview, we will give his own words. "He summoned me," says the Florentine ambassador, "and in the calmest manner showed me his joy at the success of this enterprise, which he assured me he had spoken of to me the evening before. I remember that he did, but I did not at that time understand what he meant. Next he explained, in terms of much feeling and lively affection for our city, the different motives which had made him desire your alliance, a desire to which he hopes you will respond. He ended with charging me to lay 3 proposals before your lordships. First, that you rejoice with him in the destruction at a single blow of the mortal enemies of the king, himself, and you, and the consequent disappearance of all seeds of trouble and dissension likely to waste Italy. This service of his, together with his refusal to allow the prisoners to march against you, ought, he thinks, to excite your gratitude towards him. Secondly, he begs that you will at this juncture give him a striking proof of your friendliness, by urging your cavalry's advance towards Borgo, and there assembling some infantry also, in order that they may march with him, should need arise, on Castello or on Perugia. Lastly, he desires, and this is his 3rd condition, that you arrest the Duke of Urbino, if he should flee from Castello into your territories, when he learns that Vitellozzo is a prisoner." When I objected that to give him up would not beseem the dignity of the Republic, and that you would never consent, he approved of my words, and said that it would be enough for you to keep the Duke, and not give him his liberty without his Excellency's permission. I have promised to give you all this information, to which he awaits your reply. The same night 8 masked men descended to the dungeon where the prisoners lay. They believed at that moment that the fatal hour had arrived for all. But this time the executioners had to do with Vitellozzo and Oliverotto alone. When these 2 captains heard that they were condemned, Oliverotto burst forth into reproaches against Vitellozzo, saying that it was all his fault that they had taken up arms against the Duke. Not a word Vitellozzo answered except a prayer that the Pope might grant him plenary indulgence for all his sins. Then the masked men took them away, leaving Orsino and Gravina to await a similar fate, and led away the 2 chosen out to die to a secluded spot outside the ramparts of the town, where they were strangled and buried at once in 2 trenches that had been dug beforehand. The 2 others were kept alive until it should be known if the Pope had arrested Cardinal Orsino, Archbishop of Florence and Lord of Santa Croce, and when the answer was received in the affirmative from His Holiness, Gravina and Orsino, who had been transferred to a castle, were likewise strangled. The Duke, leaving instructions with Michelotto, set off for Sinigalia as soon as the first execution was over, assuring Machiavelli that he had never had any other thought than that of giving tranquillity to the Romagna and to Tuscany, and also that he thought he had succeeded by taking and putting to death the men who had been the cause of all the trouble, also that any other revolt that might take place in the future would be nothing but sparks that a drop of water could extinguish. The Pope had barely learned that Caesar had his enemies in his power when, eager to play the same winning game himself, he announced to Cardinal Orsino, though it was then midnight, that his son had taken Sinigalia, and gave him an invitation to come the next morning and talk over the good news. The cardinal, delighted at this increase of favour, did not miss his appointment. So in the morning he started on horseback for the Vatican, but at a turn of the first street he met the governor of Rome with a detachment of cavalry, who congratulated him on the happy chance that they were taking the same road, and accompanied him to the threshold of the Vatican. There the cardinal dismounted and began to ascend the stairs. Scarcely, however, had he reached the first landing before his mules and carriages were seized and shut in the palace stables. When he entered the hall of the Perropont, he found that he and all his suite were surrounded by armed men, who led him into another apartment, called the Vicar's Hall, where he found the abbot Alviano, the protonotary Orsino, Jacopo Santa Croce, and Rinaldo Orsino, who were all prisoners like himself. At the same time the governor received orders to seize the castle of Monte Giardino, which belonged to the Orsini, and take away all the jewels, all the hangings, all the furniture, and all the silver that he might find. The governor carried out his orders conscientiously, and brought to the Vatican everything he seized, down to the cardinal's account book. On consulting the book, the Pope found out two things: first, that a sum of 2,000 ducats was due to the cardinal, no debtor's name being mentioned; secondly, that the cardinal had bought 3 months before, for 1,500 Roman crowns, a magnificent pearl which could not be found among the objects belonging to him, on which Alexander ordered that from that very moment until the negligence in the cardinal's account was repaired, the men who were in the habit of bringing him food twice a day on behalf of his mother should not be admitted into the Castle St. Angelo. The same day the cardinal's mother sent the Pope the 2,000 ducats, and the next day his mistress, in man's attire, came in person to bring the missing pearl. His Holiness, however, was so struck with her beauty in this costume that, we are told, he let her keep the pearl for the same price she had paid for it. Then the Pope allowed the cardinal to have his food brought as before, and he died of poison on the 22nd of February, that is, 2 days after his accounts had been set right. The same night the Prince of Squillaci set off to take possession, in the Pope's name, of the lands of the deceased. End of section 24.